Hello, everyone. It is Friday of week 1 of Advent. And if you are choosing to do the candles, make sure you light that first one. All right, I'm going to take a minute to just quickly review what we've done this week regarding hope. And then we are going to delve into what is hope and what does it have to do with our faith. It's a big topic, but we're going to nail it, okay? All right, here we go. This week, we have seen the hope that the Jewish people had in the messenger and in their Messiah. Mainly in the Messiah, but the hope that the messenger has arrived and the Messiah would be coming. We've looked at prophecy and how the hope that we have now comes from the fulfilled prophecy of the past. We know that Jesus walks with us through the lows and the highs of life. We have learned that God knows our desires and that sometimes He even works miracles to bring those about, even when we've lost hope in what we want. And we've learned that we can have hope in the direst of circumstances. And of course, we have hope in the future that Jesus has promised us, and we have hope in Jesus, right? That's where our hope lies. So today we're going to be discussing why hope is so crucial to faith and how it is that they go hand in hand. So first we're going to start off with what is hope. Most people would say hope is a feeling. It's an expectation, a feeling of expectation that's rooted in our desires or our wishes for something to come about. But biblical hope is different. It goes a little further than earthly hope. It's an expectation with certainty that God will do what He has said. Okay, so what's the difference between the earthly hope and the biblical hope? The earthly hope is about feelings, and it originates in the feelings. And biblical hope is about certainty. Both have the expectation, but one is based on feelings and desires and wants, and the other is based on a guarantee. So what is this guarantee? It's God. God is the guarantee. And this is why faith and hope are intertwined. Stay with me. All right. God cannot lie. Because He cannot lie, we can believe what He says. And He has promised us through Jesus and through the scriptures that He will save believers from hell. And He will take those believers to a place called heaven where we can be in right relationship with Him and, no more pain and sorrow and all of those things. And He will dwell with us. He's promised a lot of other things too, but we're going to just focus there. Belief, or our faith, causes us to hope, and hope strengthens our faith. So if we truly believe who Jesus is, right, because we say we're believers, so we believe in Jesus and what He says, then we have to take the whole Bible as truth, because Jesus said it was true. Okay? So if you believe in Jesus, you believe in the whole Bible. If you believe in the whole Bible, then you can hope for what the Bible promises. See how that line of logic goes? Okay. So why do you pray? You pray because your hope is in God who can change it, whatever it is you're praying about. Why do you endure persecution or discrimination or social awkwardness or, people treating you differently because of your faith? You do that because your hope is in what God promises for your future. Why do you witness to other people? To share your hope. Why do you read the Bible? Because you have hope that you can grow your relationship with God. Hope and faith intertwined. So what do you have without hope? Fear, doubt, anxiety, confusion, uncertainty. Not a lot of great things, and things that don't represent hope. Don't represent faith. Faith is to not have fear, to not despair because you have hope in Jesus, to not be uncertain. You know where you're going, after physical death. You don't have anxiety. How many times does the Bible tell us, don't be anxious because God will take care of you, right? You don't have the doubt. So Hope and faith, again, intertwined. If you remove the element of hope, you will discover your joy, your enthusiasm, your peace, your motivation, your focus, everything attached to your walk with God goes with it. Okay? That is why you cannot lose hope. And that is why Satan will try his hardest to steal the hope from you. Okay? Hope motivates the faith. So when you have faith, okay, that leads to hope, and then hope turnarounds and acts upon the faith. So we'll get into this a little bit because it can get kind of confusing. And we're going to start in Hebrews 11, verses 1 and verse 6. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Verse 6. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So you have to have the hope in order to have the assurance of hope, which is the definition of faith. Okay? So if you read the verses backwards a little bit, it might be a little helpful. If you believe that God will reward you, then you have to believe that he exists in order to reward you. And in order for you to believe that he exists, you have to have the believing faith. Does that make sense? So you have faith, which leads you to believe that God exists, which leads you to believe that God will reward you, which is your hope. So Paul goes on to explain this whole thing a little bit more by using Old Testament examples. He probably figured that a lot of us are sitting here confused with all of the roundabouts. So, continuing in Hebrews 11, verse 7. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Noah. Many of you may know this account. God tells Noah, I'm going to flood the earth because it's so wicked, but I'm going to save you and your family because you have been faithful to me. So build this ark, and he gives them a ton of instructions on how to build an ark. Okay, so Noah would not have built that ark if he didn't have the hope that God would save him. And he wouldn't have built the ark if he didn't have faith in God. This is how it worked. Noah had faith in God. He believed God. So when God said, I'm going to flood the earth and everybody's going to die, Noah believed in him. And then he hoped that God would save him when God said, build an ark and you will be safe. That hope of that future event is what drove him to build the ark. Does that make sense? Okay, he had to have both, the faith and the hope, and they worked with each other to produce an ark, which, of course, saved him and his family. So we'll continue in verses 8 through 12. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Okay, so there's quite a bit here. Abraham lives in Ur. It's a city. He's a very rich man, okay? And God tells him, I want you to leave Ur. We're going to go to this promised land. Abraham doesn't know where that is. And, oh, by the way, I'm going to give you descendants so numerous that they're like grains of sand on the beach. Who counts that? Nobody. That's just way too many. That's a lot of descendants, okay? A lot. And so Abraham, even though he's totally rich and could live the high life where he's at, picks up everything and starts walking. And we're not talking about, this is just like a few bags. Okay, we're talking servants and tents and cattle and money and everything, right? It's a huge ordeal. And he heads out. And you have to understand that where he's going, he isn't owning this land. He is a foreigner in every land that he goes to at this point. And he does that for several reasons. First, he has faith that God is who he says he is, that he's God. Which, when God tells him, I need you to move, and this is what's going to go down, he has hope in that promise. He has hope that he's going to have all these descendants, just like God said, and that he is going to, his descendants will be in this promised land that God has told him would be theirs, okay? If he didn't have hope that that would come about, he would not have done all that. And if he didn't have faith that God was who he said he was, then he wouldn't really have hope in the promise that God gave him. So we see that he had both faith and hope in order to move forward, right? The hope motivated the action. And we will see later that he endures quite a bit doing this. This wasn't, some joyride to get there. And we see here Sarah, who obviously is going to bear the child. Let's talk about this for a minute, because Paul's kind of humorous here, because he says one man, Abraham, who was as good as dead. Now, I want you to be real clear as to what Paul means here. He was so old, he was just about dead. I mean, he means that very literally. Abraham and Sarah were very old. They were in their upper 90s, okay? So the child thing was far from what they expected. And they didn't have any children, okay? And so Sarah had to have the hope that it would really come true so that she and Abraham could consummate the action in order to have the child. And for those of you who know the story, there was a few bumps in this faith and hope journey, but she got there. She hoped in it so much that she actually committed some sins in order to try to make it happen. So she definitely had the hope that it would come true. And it's a little bumpy, but I think we can all relate that a lot of times our spiritual journey is a little bumpy and we make mistakes along the way. So you might be thinking, okay, but that's real easy for them because, they were promised descendants and they had a kid. You can kind of reach out and touch the kid, right? I can't reach out and touch heaven. I can't reach out and touch peace, but I will point you to Paul and what he wrote. So let's go ahead and read Hebrews 11, 13 through 16. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared them for a city. Okay, so we've got kind of two thought processes going on here at the same time. First, let's deal with the earthly. Abraham and Sarah died before they saw the fulfillment. Remember, the promise was, number one, promised land. They didn't make it there. It wasn't totally theirs. Okay. Number two, they had a descendant, but they did not have so many descendants that you couldn't count them. Okay. So even though their promises had been, the fulfillment had been started, they had not come to totality. Okay. And they didn't see that. So, but they still acted knowing that it would come, hoping in the outcome for later generations. Okay. And the other earthly point here is that, they were focused on the future, on the hope. If they had been looking back to the whole time, they wouldn't have gotten there. They would have just gone back. But they weren't focused on what was there. They were focused on where God was taking them. Okay. Now, the heavenly aspect of this, which is kind of intertwined all together, is that they also knew that they were moving toward a spiritual heavenly place, right? That after death was this glorious place that they were going to, and this was different than the promised land. It's not the same thing, but that part of their journey was to that too. So not only were they hopeful in the physical in front of them kind of promise, but they were also looking toward that heavenly promise, right? And what that meant for them. And that's what Paul is referring to when he is saying, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Okay, so they acted on their faith in hope, both for the earthly promise and for the heavenly promise. And that's just like what we do today, right? We can't touch that heavenly place. We can't necessarily touch peace when Jesus gives us peace, but we can experience it still, and we can hope in it still, right? Our faith and our hope together. All right, let's move on. Hebrews 11:17-19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, "Through Isaac shall your offspring be named." He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So remember when I said that his journey was not an easy one? Well, I would say probably the hardest part was literally Abraham was told to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. Sacrifice as in like kill. Okay? And Abraham took Isaac on the journey, brought all the wood, everything, tied him up, put him on the pile of wood, and then God, sent a ram, and Isaac was saved, and the angel said, you don't have to do that, and there you go. But Abraham obeyed. And here we see that he was like, you know what? God has promised me that through Isaac, my descendants will come, and they can't come if Isaac's dead. So he went up there with the hope that God would resurrect Isaac from the dead or something. There was a hope that God's gonna fix this. And so he was obedient. He acted on it. And if you read the account, you will see that God did indeed save Isaac from physical death. And so, but Abraham would not have been able to do that without faith and without hope. Because if he didn't have hope that God would somehow rescue his son, he wouldn't have been able to do that. Because not only do I mean that in an emotional capacity, there are people who kill their children. Okay? He could have gotten over that. But it would have been hard for him to believe in the promise that God gave him of the descendants if there was nobody to have the descendants. Okay? The very person that God said, this is the kid who your offspring, it wouldn't have happened. So he had to have had the hope in order to go through with that. And he would have had to have a lot of faith too. I mean, we'll just say that took a lot of faith and a lot of hope to accomplish that. So in the hope of the promises given to their family, Isaac, the son who almost got sacrificed, then Jacob, descendant, blessed their children accordingly, and Joseph gave the Hebrews instructions to take his bones to the promised land when they got there. So this is kind of a lot smashed into one, but let's read the verses first and then we'll take it apart. Verses 20-22. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history behind this so you can understand the importance of what he's saying. Isaac gave blessings to Jacob and Esau. In this time period, when somebody was on their deathbed, they would bless their children. And part of this blessing was future and looking toward the future, right? So it wasn't just money and inheritance, but it was also a blessing on the child for their future, okay? And when Isaac did this with Jacob and Esau, he did so with the memory of what God had promised him and his descendants. So he's passing on the promise because he still hasn't seen it come to fruition. So he's passing it on to his descendants. And then Jacob, when he was dying, passed it on to basically his grandkids. Joseph was one of his sons, and so Joseph's sons, he passed that blessing on to them. Okay? And he did that while he was dying. At this point in time, they were in Egypt. Okay? So a lot of history went on, and they are now the descendants of the promised land, that they're getting the promised land, are in Egypt. And Joseph, when he's on his deathbed, he basically says, when the Hebrew people leave, dig up my bones and take them to the promised land. So he's like, God has not given us this promised land yet, but when he does, you better make sure my bones go there. Okay. Now, those are some people who seriously have faith in God and hope in what he has promised, right? So much so that on their deathbed, they want to make sure that hope is passed on to their kids. And so much so that Joseph wants his bones taken out of Egypt to the promised land. Okay? So let's talk about Moses, since we're in Egypt. Let's read verses 23 to 31. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. All right. Moses. When he was born, there was an edict from the Pharaoh that all male babies of the Hebrews were thrown into the river and killed. But his parents had faith in God and hope that he would be rescued, and they put him in a basket and hid him in the river Nile. And he was rescued by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the palace. He hoped in the Lord to rescue the people. He would not have stood in front of Pharaoh performing all these plagues and miracles and incurring the wrath of not just the Pharaoh, but his relative. I mean, he grew up with this person, right? He would not have done all that if he did not have the faith and hope that what God said would happen would happen. And so all of the people hoped in the Lord when they covered their doorposts with blood. Okay, so the 10th plague was all the firstborn in Egypt were going to die. And the only way they would be saved is if they put the blood of a lamb over their doorpost. This is what we call Passover now. Okay, and whoever had blood on their doorposts, basically the destroyer, the being that was going to take the life of the firstborn, would pass over that house. Okay, now, first, if you didn't have faith that God would do what he said he was going to do, you would be like the Egyptians. Who is this God? My firstborn's fine. Whatever. Right? So first of all, the people had faith, the Hebrew people. Secondly, they had hope. Because if they had faith that he would actually kill the firstborn, but they didn't have hope, then they wouldn't have put the blood on the doorpost, right? there was no hope in being saved. So when they took the action to put the blood over the doorpost, they were putting their hope in the promise that that blood on their doorpost would save their firstborn from death. Okay, so the hope motivated them to put their faith in action. So let's continue verses 32 through 38. What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. That's heavy, guys. What he's saying is there are so many examples that he can't even name them all. But these people, because of their faith, which led to hope and action on their faith, they conquered kingdoms. They did all these things that we're talking about here. And they would not have done it if they did not have hope in the fulfillment of what God had promised. Okay? If God said, go conquer a city, and if you do it in this fashion, then you will take it over, right? The hope that his promise is accurate is what drove them to do it the way they were supposed to. And let me tell you, there are examples of where they didn't, and they didn't conquer, or they didn't get what God had promised. Can you see that faith and hope are intertwined? Would people allow themselves to be sawed in half if they didn't have the hope of the future that Jesus promised post-physical death? You have to have faith in order to have hope. However, hope without faith is a weak faith indeed. Imagine if you were a Hebrew for the 10th plague, and you had the faith that the firstborn was going to be killed, but you didn't have hope in the promise that those would put blood on the doorpost would be saved. How would that have turned out? Our hope is central to our faith. At the very base level, our belief in Jesus is based in the hope that he will save us from eternal damnation. And what are all of us believers, past and present, looking toward? We're looking toward the day when we are in full restoration with God Almighty, the day when the old earth passes away and a new heaven and a new earth comes into being in all their splendor that's talked about in Revelation 21 will be here. We look forward to the day when God looks at us and says, "Well done, my good and faithful servant."